Chapter 3. Time to Matter. If my arrest wasn't bad enough, what I never even considered, as selfish as I obviously was Sarah, Noah, or the fact that Christmas was just a few weeks away. That was something else the officers reminded me of as they walked me down to the booking area. Whatever strange peace I'd felt before getting to the jailhouse completely vanished. As I sat there, waiting to get fingerprinted, reality set in. I knew another Lucian Graves was going to be disappointing his son once again, and maybe this time, even to the point of no return. After being fingerprinted, I went in front of the magistrate. There wasn't much to that, just a middle-aged, portly man sitting behind a desk who barely glanced up at me as he read off the charges. He no more than mumbled, destruction of property, disturbing the peace, and criminal mischief. Then he finally looked up, but that was just to wave a sheriff over to take me away. They stuck me in a holding cell with 3 other men, none of whom talked to anyone else. Everything in that overlay, cramped 4-cot room was concrete and painted in that drab, hopeless shade of cream, except for the sink, the open-air toilet, and the mattresses. In fairness, the 1-inch mattresses weren't made of concrete, but they sure felt like they were. I stared at the walls the whole night, waiting for court the next day. I thought about Noah and Sarah. I even got my one phone call. I called Sarah because I had nobody else, but no one answered. I didn't know what I would have said if she did, but I didn't have the heart to leave a message telling her that I let our family down once again. The next morning in court, I stood in front of the judge as the public defender I'd just met minutes before gave a short statement about how I just lost control, but I had no prior offenses. He mentioned I was a veteran, that I had a wife and child, that I was employed, that up until the Ruby's incident, I'd been a model citizen. Even I had to side-eye him after that statement. The judge, like the magistrate, kept his head down and just read from the stack of papers piled on his desk. They were papers I was unfortunately sure were mostly about me. Then, without warning, he barked out, "You destroyed a slot machine at Ruby's." I didn't say anything. I just stood there knowing he was right. After a pause, the judge leaned back and said, "Mr. Graves, I don't know your story, but I know the kind of men who end up here this time of year. The desperate and the broken kind. Ones who all thought they had more time. More time to make a difference, more time to leave something meaningful behind, more time to reconnect, but most importantly, more time to matter." I was absolutely stunned by those familiar words. They were the same thoughts I'd had about Lucian Graves, but hearing them out loud from a judge about me made the unfortunate truth of my family's commonality feel even stronger. I don't believe the judge said what he did to be cruel. I think he had just seen too many people waste whatever time they were given, and in his line of work, that time was often spent on self-destruction. His last words to me were, "I'm sentencing you to 30 days in the county jail." The gavel didn't slam. The courtroom wasn't appalled, and no one fainted from shock. In fact, that was the most popular Christmas present given out that day. And just like that, I was led away again, only this time it was for 30 days. They put me on an old dark blue bus that backfired every now and then. It was with the same 3 guys I'd share the cell with the night before. Dexter, a really young guy, cried and threw up halfway to the jail. I'm guessing he never felt any of that original peace I felt at Ruby's. The guy around Lucian Graves' age, who had to be in his 70s or close, stayed just as quiet as he'd been the night before. The third, a man somewhere near my age, acted like he was headed to summer camp rather than jail. He was overly jolly considering the situation we were in, and he told jokes the whole way back. Looking out the window of that rickety old bus, I saw people in town on ladders hanging Christmas lights and putting up garland. If that wasn't a bad enough reminder of how poorly I'd timed my ignorance, the bus driver was also singing along to the Christmas music that he conveniently had tuned in on the radio. It seemed like no one had a care in the world about anything except for 2 out of the 4 of us in the back of the bus. Our town wasn't overly small, but it wasn't too big either, So, ironically, the holding cell from the night before ended up being our somewhat permanent lodging after we got back. And it sucked just as much as it did the night before. The other thing I noticed right away was the guards who were almost cordial the night before weren't nearly as friendly when we returned. As we re-entered the jail, they shuffled us into what they called the inspection room. They took our belts, our shoes, and eventually the rest of our clothes too. Then came the part where we had to bend over and touch our toes. We were all standing there, stripped stark naked in a straight line for the full inspection. They had to inspect the front side, back side, and even the back side of our front side, apparently. It was so embarrassing. As uncomfortable as that was, even the guards chuckled when it was Deuce's turn. He was the other guy close to my age, and when they got over to him, he yelled out, "Hey, man, this ain't that kind of party." I'd thought my job at work was bad, inspecting parts all day, but I knew right then and there I'd never want to be that kind of inspector. Once we were allowed to stand straight up again and reclothe ourselves, I noticed Dexter. He looked like a lost little boy in an almost grown man's body. Even though I'm a little ashamed to admit it, to me, he represented so many of the things that bothered me about coming back home after the war. These young people with their loud opinions and very little real-world experience, protesting things that seemed to be more about being seen rather than actually standing for something, and worse, being completely unaware about the true cost, whether to themselves or those around them. I knew, deep down, I probably fit into that last category more than I wanted to admit, but I've also carried my friends' body bags in a war that nobody understood. But we didn't fight for headlines or attention. We fought for each other. Being we did that without question, that made it real, and when it came down to it, we stood until the very end for each other if need be. We were all in that courtroom together, so we heard what each of us had done, and we all heard that now familiar 30-day holiday sentence. Every one of us except for Poppy. The old man that was also in our cell was called up to the judge after we were taken out, and no one asked what he'd done. He never told us either. Deuce, according to the judge, was a frequent flyer, mostly drunk in public or the occasional bar scuffle, and even though I knew he wasn't drunk at the time, he sure acted like he was most of the time. So, there we all were. Father Time, the drunk, the coward, and me, Lucian Graves Jr., the extremely lost. We were all roommates for the next 30 days, whether we liked it or not. The first day was a lot like the night before court, mostly silent. But as I'd learned over and over again, silence can be deafening. We were all pretending not to watch each other when Poppy finally spoke. He didn't address anyone by name. He never did. Whenever he spoke to any of us, it was always, "Buddy." No matter who you were or what you've done, you were always buddy to him. The first real conversation he led started with a question which was, "Have you ever heard of the story about the soldier who played dead so long he forgot he was alive?" None of us knew what to say. I think it was more of an icebreaker than anything else, but at least I kind of knew where he was trying to lead us. It was most likely his way of letting us know he understood we'd all screwed up, himself included, but we were all still alive. Maybe that was his point. If we're lucky enough to still be breathing, we better start acting like it, regardless of where we were or what we had ever done. Slowly but surely, after the third or fourth day, us four got as used to each other as strangers can. There weren't too many minutes of each day that I didn't think about Noah and Sarah, but Lucian Graves took up a good portion of my thinking too. I wondered if he was still in that hospital bed, sunken down in the sheets, or if my namesake had already slipped away to wherever it was he was going next. Time in that place was a whole lot like sitting with the watcher. It mostly stood still without even a blink. Each day, they did let us out of our overly cream-colored accommodations for 2 hours to shower and exercise outside if we wanted. Other than that, it was just us four inside that damn 12 by 12 concrete dungeon. Everything else we did, to include eating, using the bathroom, or trying to sleep, was done right there in that cell together. Little by little, each of us started opening up to one another. We were as different as night and day, especially me and Dexter, but the fact was there was so much of that damn time on our hands we had nothing else to do. Even though I rarely talked about it until then, I knew Sarah realized I never came home all the way, and that war is always evil for every family. She was right, though. As she'd so often say, even though my body was there, something inside of me stayed behind. I'm sure she held on as long as she could. She was just waiting for the man she married to return, but the truth is, I never really did. Poppy was also in a war, and yes, even though all war is truly terrible, I could tell his was worse. The burn marks, even at his age, were more than obvious. They ran down his neck to the bottom of his back like a river, and his eyes were as deep as any ocean. They were glazed over in a way that only men who've seen too much ever get. Many of my older sergeants back in my war had that exact same glare. I don't know what Poppy actually saw, but I do know no man should ever have to see what I'm sure he did. Come to find out, even Deuce had an unexpected military connection. He never served himself, but his father was an Army guy also. Deuce said he'd lived in 8 states growing up in 3 different countries. That was all by the time he was 17, but not one place ever felt like home, according to him. He made it clear that he still didn't feel like he'd ever had a place to call home, anywhere. I think Dexter felt a little uncomfortable listening to all our grown-up stories, but in fairness, he was so young he hadn't had time to figure out who or what he was really about yet. Poppy was usually the one of us who ever said anything profound, but I did pass along some of the best advice my grandfather ever gave me. My grandfather, who I called Papa, would always say, "The only thing any of us knows comes from our environment and our experiences." When I was younger, I usually didn't understand his intended lessons at first, but the older I got, the more I realized just how right he was almost all of the time. My grandparents both passed away when I was 16. Then my mother died about a week after I turned 18. Talk about feeling alone. That's exactly what I was. I had no one, absolutely nobody, and after a while I had nowhere to go either, except for the military, that is. I didn't tell my whole story to Dexter. Some things you hope people pick up on their own without having to spell it out. But I kept thinking about what my papa meant, which to me was, if you're paying attention, time teaches you things that you couldn't have known any sooner. Not because you're stupid or stubborn, but because some lessons can only come from when life wears you down, and for most of us, that takes time. Kind of like being sent to jail for tearing up a slot machine in a casino and getting 30 days in jail to think about your actions, I guess. The lessons continue until we finally get what we are supposed to learn. Whether those lessons are harsh or not, they keep coming until you get it. Even I believe the world doesn't necessarily become easier as you age, but it does start to become clearer if you slow down long enough to pay attention. This chapter of my life is probably where I've failed the most, where I was the foggiest. However, even I am starting to realize that maybe some people in your life didn't walk away at all. They just didn't know how to stay. The environmental lesson that my grandfather so often spoke about is the part we don't get to pick. Some of it lifts you up, and some brings you down. But most of it just leaves you trying to figure out whether you want to stay where you are or go somewhere else. When you're young, it can all blur together. There seems to be a mixture of good voices and bad ones, the people that truly care and the ones that just want company traveling down the wrong path. It's not always easy to tell the difference between the good and the bad either, because most of the time, the loudest person in the room isn't the strongest. They're just the most afraid. And sometimes the quiet ones, the ones we rarely think about or give much time to, end up being the ones with the best way forward. I guess once I was finally forced to sit still long enough in that jail cell, I started to see that I wasn't the only one carrying real pain and disappointment. I probably wasn't the only one who needed that time to think without distractions either. Maybe this was just another forced life lesson because there is no question that both our experience and environment is very much being controlled for us. I began thinking maybe we all had a chance to help each other change while there. It didn't matter if what broke us came from where we were raised or from what we'd been through. In other words, regardless of our past experiences or our past environment, as my papa would so often say. It's funny how sometimes it takes a complete upheaval in life for some of us to realize how blessed we really are, but even more so, how those are often the times when we can help others the most. Those may be the best times to take our eyes and our thoughts off of ourselves. On that note, I can't say I'll ever understand the decisions Lucian Graves made, or my own lately. But I do have to admit I didn't know his whole story, or where his experiences and environment led him. But I will say I knew he had also been in the military. So again, maybe we were more alike than I ever wanted to admit before.